The Scythians were an equestrian nomadic people of Iranian origin who dominated the Eurasian steppe. Their territory extended from the Balkans to Mongolia and China. The Scythians flourished from around the 700th century BC, pretty much north of the Caspian and Black Seas. Scythian is kind of a basket term for this wide group of culturally similar people. Being that they were nomadic and covered such a vast territory, it's hard to fully pinpoint them. The Scythians didn't write anything, so the records of them is limited to archaeological finds and contemporary historians such as Herodotus, as well as folk and oral tradition. The Scythians are often referred to as the horse lords. They're really the first masters of horseback riding and horseback combat, especially horse archery. The Scythians were some of the most feared warriors in the ancient world. This was before the invention of the stirrup, and they used this padded saddle to help control and position themselves for their archery. Their bows were very well designed. They were short bows that still allowed for a full draw. Their quivers were attached to their hips and faced backwards so that they could easily reach and grab and nock a new arrow, and it was thought that they used a thumb draw. Recreation of their bows kind of confirmed that it could be fully drawn even on horseback. They also coated their arrows in a mixture of viper venom and human blood. Women were also warriors in the Scythian culture. It's thought that these warrior women were the inspiration or origin of the myths of the Amazonian warrior women. One, I guess you could say, faction within the Scythian culture, the Massagetai, had a famous queen named Tomyris. Allegedly, after her son died, she defeated Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cyrus and his army was defeated in battle. She decapitated him and put his head in a vat of blood and said, "There, now you can quench your thirst for blood." The Scythians also wore a lot of elaborate tattoos. Their tattoos consisted of animals and mythological beasts. This is actually a picture of skin from a Scythian. The reason why it's so well preserved is because they mummified their dead. On top of this, a lot of their artifacts and bodies were preserved in the frost. Here's a kind of drawing of some of those tattoos. The Scythians also collected scalps and skulls from their enemies, as well as they would drink the blood of their enemies. Supposedly, they had a yearly banquet where they gathered all of their collected scalps and skulls and presented them to their chief or king. Herodotus writes that once a year, the governor of each district, set a place in his own province, mingles a bowl of wine, of which all the Scythians have a right to drink, by whom foes have been slain. So based off of their success in battle, they would be able to drink more of this wine. And if they didn't slay anyone, they would be ashamed and not allowed to drink any. This is another recreation of a Scythian horse dress. We often associate the lack of any written record as being a very primitive people. But we could see from this and the tattoos that they were very artistic. They wore elaborate and ornate clothes, and their weapons were very well designed. They also produced a lot of gold artifacts and wore a lot of jewelry. And this is a piece of horse headgear. Herodotus writes that they anoint and wash their heads, but for their bodies, they never bathed. Instead, they created this sort of weed sauna. They would take red-hot stones and put them under a mat, and then they would throw hemp seeds. There is debate as to whether they actually used the seeds or the leaves of hemp. He says that the Scythians howl in their joy at the vapor bath. This serves them instead of bathing, for they never wash their bodies with water. Hemp, or weed, can have a lot of antibacterial or antimicrobial properties. On top of this, if they did this after a battle, let's say, it would help with wound cleaning and wound healing and relaxation as an anti-inflammatory. More famous than their use of hemp was a staple in their diet, fermented horse milk. In fact, the Scythians were originally referred to as the milk drinkers. As the saying goes, an army marches on its stomach. Kumis is the name of this fermented mare's milk. For the microbial side of things, a bacteria acidified the milk, and a type of yeast carbonated and turned it into a mildly alcoholic drink, probably around 2%. One study identified 14 different species of lactobacillus and 11 species of yeast. Though the number and type of species would vary from region to region, even the type of horse and probably the time of year. So this was a highly beneficial and probiotic beverage. And it makes sense that they use horse milk because they were equestrian nomads. And I'm sure that this played a role in their bond with their horses. The Ossetes is a small nation in the Central Caucasus that is the last remaining linguistic and cultural descendants of the ancient nomadic Scythians. They preserved a rich oral literature through the Epic of the Narts, a body of heroic legends that share much in common with the Persian Book of Kings and other works of Indo-European mythology. Here is Ossetia on the map. And it's actually this Caucasus region, these descendants of the Scythians, that we get the drink Kefir. Kefir is a soured milk beverage using what's called Kefir grains. Kefir grains aren't actual grain, but a cluster of complex microbial communities. They're made up of many different species of yeast and bacteria that are all highly beneficial. These grains are left in milk and allowed to sour to produce a drink that's a lot like yogurt. There's a lot of folk legends and stories from this region about kefir grains. One of these stories is that the Prophet Muhammad learned how to make kefir and gave these to people and taught them how to make it. And it was said to have miraculous or magical properties. Throughout the entire world is a long history of fermented, soured, and cultured foods that descend from traditional recipes. That will have to be covered in another video. For now, we're going to get back to the Scythians. There is also evidence of trade between the Scythians and the Celtics, and they naturally followed these rivers, which basically served as highways. There is quite a bit of evidence that Scythians did make their way to especially Ireland, Scotland, and Britain. And the Picts also may have been related to the Scythians. This paper, which you can check out if you're interested in more, talks about the Iranian roots of the legends of King Arthur. Through trade, migrations of people, and possibly even conquests, these stories got mixed and melded and diffused into these other cultures. And it's not that the Arthurian legend is exclusively Iranian or Scythian, but that there are elements of it which are clearly Scythian or Iranian. And I think it's important to talk about that humans weren't stuck in one place until modernity. We call them nomads, but then we don't think of them as actually having traveled anywhere. And I know that these kinds of topics can get mixed with politics or just be very touchy. It's just fascinating to explore, and it doesn't change the worth or value of anything. It just shows that cultures are deeply interconnected. But I also don't like we're all one people. It's just that this is the history of our ancestors. This is the history of the world. People migrated, they moved around and traded and told stories and fought and conquered each other. It's just a lot more complex than saying that these ancient people were limited to these geographic boundaries. In 1320, the Scottish declared their independence in the Declaration of Arbroath, and they talk about how they came from Scythia. It's a tale of their own traditional knowledge of their own origins. There's a lot of Scottish and Irish chroniclers that claim descent from the Scythians, or at least that it was part of what ultimately formed those cultures. And they say that the actual name of the Scots comes from the Scythians. Even people like King Alfred referred to them as Scythians. Irish writers say the same thing, that the Scots were Scythians. It's also possible that Saxons comes from another name for the Scythians, the Saka or the Sake, meaning that Saxon would be son of Saka or Sake. So in the Ossetian Nart Sagas, they reference these warrior women, and that they talk about this cauldron or barrel of the Narts as it was a sort of horn of plenty. For the arguments of the Iranian origin of the Arthurian Cycle, they say it's related to the Holy Grail. I do wonder if the cauldron or Holy Grail of the Nart Cycle was actually some sort of fermented milk, like the fermented horse milk or the Kefir milk. I didn't find any direct evidence of that, but it was just a thought that I had, a possibility. This is a footnote for another story in the Nart Saga. The hero has proven his true worth by inserting his weapon into the ground in such a way that no one can extract it. Obviously being reminiscent of the sword in the stone myth. The Nart Saga is just so interesting because you have this mythology of these local people that came from this nomadic people whose core or descent was Iranian. But the mythology kind of is in between the Vedic, Iranian, Greek, Nordic, and Arthurian. These stories are very old folk and oral tradition. The migrations of these nomadic peoples probably in part why it's Indo-European. These people that brought these stories and they mixed and diffused in culture, and those stories over generations became their own thing. And these completely unique cultures that have kind of vague elements of each other from all different parts of the world. I think it's odd that the Scythians and the Nart Saga is just like a footnote in history, despite how impactful this nomadic culture seems to have been.